Hi everyone, my name is Emily, and I'm the young adult librarian at the Rock Island Public Library. Here is the third episode in our new series of book and movie pairings that we're calling Terrifying Trios. Each month, I'll give you 2 horror movie recommendations and a book that complements them. These books and movies will share a theme of some kind, and for episode 3, I'll be discussing a delightfully unsettling trope in horror movies, doppelgangers. A doppelganger is an apparition or double of a living person. Usually this other you has some kind of sinister purpose. And if you and your doppelganger are truly identical, even those you trust may have a hard time telling who's the real you. Sources for this episode include Wikipedia and Vanity Fair. Content warning. The movies and book I'll be discussing today contain graphic depictions of murder and death, including death by fire, bludgeoning, stabbing, death in or around water, death by falling, and more, as well as attempted murder and simulated rape. Viewer and reader discretion is advised. May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and if you've ever seen a horror movie, you know that the genre does not always do the best job of exploring mental illness and trauma in constructive ways. It bears noting that the vast majority of people who suffer from mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators of it, contrary to what horror movies would have you believe. With that being said, I think these 3 titles do a fair job of trying to explore mental health in a way that goes beyond demonizing those afflicted. The thing is, in all of these titles, even when people try to do the right thing in terms of treatment and supporting someone struggling with mental health issues, the situation may not turn out well. After all, this is horror, and there's often a twist. Our first title is Perfect Blue, a movie directed by the late, great Satoshi Kon. This is an animated movie, it's an anime, and actually 3 of his movies are available on Hoopla, including this one. Mima Kirigoe is part of a semi-popular J-pop group, but she's decided to leave music behind for a career in acting. Now, not everyone is thrilled with this change, including a man who begins stalking Mima. And it doesn't help that her first role is in Double Bind, a detective show where the character she's playing is raped. Her manager asks if she really wants to go through with this scene, and though it's handled with care by the people involved, the cast and the crew, it's still traumatic. It's as Mima is riding away from the job when she sees a reflection of her former idol self, who declares that of course she didn't want to do the scene. Mima spends much of the film wondering who she can trust, especially after some people turn up dead. Can she rely on those around her to keep her safe? Or are even her own perceptions of reality becoming skewed by trauma? Is she still herself? Or is there another her, a more real version of Mima, who wants to replace her? In the end, Mima is able to confront her stalker, and the mastermind behind him, who ends up institutionalized when the cause of the murders committed is better understood. Mima realizes that the doppelganger she saw was a hallucination brought on by her experiences. She knows that she's her true self, and the film ends with her having become a successful actress. However, there are a lot of bumps on the road to this mostly happy conclusion. Satoshi Kon is a director famous for exploring the place where the real and unreal meet. And as a viewer, you go along with Mima wondering if you can trust what you see. Though he directed only a few films before he passed away, 3 of which, again, you can watch through our Hoopla app, fans of Satoshi Kon include the likes of fellow directors Christopher Nolan. The movie Paprika is often seen as one of the inspirations for Inception, and Jordan Peele. Speaking of Jordan Peele, writer and director, our second film today is Us, Peele's sophomore horror masterpiece. This film is bloody, unnerving, and also funny at times. There are many moments of humor as a family of 4 struggles to survive their murderous doppelgangers. This movie shows the protagonist, Adelaide Wilson, coping with trauma through dance. Something happened on a trip to the boardwalk when she was a kid, and afterward, she was unable to speak for a time. Now an adult, when Adelaide returns to the site of her childhood trauma, she is uneasy about being there. She can feel that something isn't right, and her fears are confirmed when, late at night, she and her husband spot a group of 4 people standing outside, their faces hidden in shadow. Sure enough, When these people break into the family's cabin, they are revealed to be terrifying duplicates of Adelaide and her family. These are the tethered, and they have come to claim the lives that they have so far only been able to imitate. The tethered live underground, and for generations they have lived sort of shadow lives in which they are connected to their surface selves, but unable to make the choices or have the agency they do. They are exactly identical to people on the surface. Everyone on the surface has someone among the tethered, a doppelganger. But what you see, for example, with Red, Adelaide's doppelganger, when Adelaide was a child, learning to dance, you can see how Red was pulled along in a shadow version of her dance recital. But Red had no training in dance, and in this scene she looks like a puppet, dragged back and forth by unseen strings above, as Adelaide moves. Red can't even make the choice to stop dancing. Until somehow, Red breaks free, and she is able to help the other tethered do the same. They change from being mostly mute copies of people living above ground to an army determined to replace their duplicates and claim their place on the surface after being forgotten underground for so long. Since the experiment that created the tether was abandoned decades ago, how does all this work, you ask? In terms of Red getting the tethered their trademark red jumpsuits, the scissors they sometimes kill people with, or food for the rabbits that they eat, I had these questions, but then realized I didn't really care about the answers. After all, Peele is a big fan of The Twilight Zone, where often strange things happen with little explanation because, at the end of the day, the explanation wouldn't be that important. The story is the interesting thing, as are the characters, and you like these characters enough that you're willing to accept that this is just how things work in this world. As they say on Mystery Science Theater 3000, it's just a show. I should really just relax. Peele has actually said that one of the inspirations for Us was an episode of The Twilight Zone from 1960 called Mirror Image, in which a woman has a duplicate with a creepy smile. Duplicates have long been a staple in sci-fi and horror, and not just because it's pretty affordable in terms of special effects, having an actor haunted by themselves. Us plays with this trope beautifully, and the end of the film calls into question what we know of the tethered. That is to say, who is the real person and who is not. In Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a classic film about doppelgangers, you have duplicates trying to replace people. In that film, you have pod people that are physically identical to the people whose lives they assume, but they are aliens devoid of emotion. Unlike the pod people in Body Snatchers, the tethered aren't aliens. They're humans who have become what they are after living their whole lives deprived of almost everything and devoid of control. Don't the tethered deserve their own lives? Ignorance of their cruelty and indifference doesn't make the surface dwellers in Us innocent. The film asks viewers to consider our own culpability in the real world, because the choices we make can and do hurt vulnerable people. And when people fight back against this kind of cruelty, is it monstrous or is it deeply human? Last, our book this month is The Dead House by Dawn Kurtagich. It tells the story of two sisters, Caitlin and Carly Johnson, who share a close bond. They're twins, so perhaps it comes as no surprise that they'd be close. But they also share the same body. That's right. When the sun is up, Carly goes to school and spends time with friends and leaves notes for Caitlin about her day. But when the sun goes down, Caitlin roams the halls of Elmbridge, their boarding school, and also sometimes sneaks out at night, which is when she meets someone who might just love her for who she is. Except, one morning, Caitlin wakes up. She's never seen daylight before, never seen the sun, and soon she comes to a terrifying realization. Carly is gone. But where is she? And can Caitlin get her back? Or is the thing that took Carly to the dead house coming for Caitlin too? This novel takes place at some undefined point in the past. We know that Caitlin and Carly's parents knew about their two daughters in one body, but they died years before the events of the book in a fire. Now, their little sister is in foster care, and the two sisters are determined to adopt her when they turn 18. But because this book is a collection of diary entries, notes, police reports, and more, we know from the beginning that something terrible happened at Elmbridge. There was a fire, and 3 people died, and Carly Johnson was never seen again. In this novel, Caitlin and Carly are being treated by a doctor who's convinced that Carly has dissociative identity disorder. This was once called multiple personality disorder. The doctor is convinced that Carly is the real personality, while Caitlin is an alter, a personality that Carly developed to deal with the trauma of her parents' death. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be a fairly reasonable diagnosis, and you could say that the doctor was trying to do the right thing in helping someone move past a traumatic event. But as the book goes on, her insistence comes to seem pretty callous. She keeps telling Carly and Caitlin that Carly is real and Caitlin is not, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Now, of course, this is proven to be the wrong diagnosis when Carly disappears and only Caitlin is left. Of course, Caitlin doesn't exactly trust a person who's been telling her she doesn't exist and that it's best if she leave Carly alone. Given the interviews that take place after the book's fiery conclusion, it's clear to readers that the doctor in this story ignored obvious signs that something more than dissociative identity disorder was going on, which is of course a cautionary tale about how we treat mental illness and how gaslighting someone who's struggling is never a good idea. And since this is a horror novel, the psychological treatment options of the time are no match for the fact that something supernatural is going on. The doctor's stubborn insistence that she is right, well, again, in the real world, this would be like somebody who's seen as a dedicated medical professional. But this is a horror novel, and there's something way weirder going on. There's the discovery, first off, of some weird writings on the walls in an abandoned school attic, and the writing looks to be written in blood. You also have attempts by Carly's friends and Caitlin's boyfriend to help both sisters. The book even features still images of video recordings that the teens make to try and understand what is happening, which we know from the beginning ends in death and destruction. This is a fascinating novel, which was inspired in part by the author's experience with inversion syndrome, in which she suddenly found herself sleeping during the day and awake at night. As author Don Kurtikich wrote, "During those nights, I began to think what kind of life someone who had only ever known such darkness would have, what she would be like. What would it feel like to be told you are a symptom or a disease? And then came the thought, what happens when the other half of your life is suddenly taken away? And what if someone told you the reason was not psychological, integration, but spiritual, demonic? How would that feel?" In the end, Caitlin and Carly discover, as many characters in horror novels do, that their isolation may have begun with a supernatural cause, but it is amplified, as most problems are, by societal indifference or mismanagement. Perhaps the scariest thing about this book is that it shows how institutions, be they medical or educational, can't always make things better for people, but they can make things worse by not listening to suffering people. And of course, with doppelgangers, any trouble is magnified by the fact that you can't rely on what seems to be a trustworthy face, even or especially if that face is your own. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next month with another terrifying trio.